as Maxine said, I'm an advanced web and interactivity engineer at Adobe. What that means is that I'll be creating prototypes and demos for some of the proposals that Adobe makes to the W3C. So some of those proposals have been CSS exclusions, regions, and shaders, and all the other exciting stuff that you're looking to have in your browser soon. And before that, I'm actually new to Adobe, so I have been at Adobe for about a month and a half. And before that, I was working at Opera, which is apparently hated by Farouk, but anyway, as a web opener. And we were doing the same things that Farouk talked about, which is to tell people to use the right prefixes and use the right standards way of doing things. So I'm also known for having open source projects with HTML5 prefixes, like HTML5 boilerplate, HTML5 please. How many of you use HTML5 please? Oh, OK, not bad. I'm glad to know somebody know about this. So HTML5 please is a page that tells you which of the HTML5 features are ready to use or not. It's an opinionated page, so take it as you like. So I have been creating websites for about 7 years, designing web pages and so on. And typically, I used to start with Photoshop or some other tool like Illustrator, and then create a mock-up, show it to clients, and get approval. So on the way, typically how websites are designed. But I have been very disenchanted with the way that process. And I have more and more come to the realization that basically mockups suck. And this is not the way we should be designing websites. And the way we should be designing websites is in the browser with HTML prototypes. So let's look at a mockup. This is a mockup, and thankfully it's not mine. And I found it on a website, forest.com, I think. And if you would notice that there are two images, one on the top right and the bottom left. And you have the text that is wrapping very neatly across both these images. Now, when this mockup meets reality, you will have dissatisfaction, unhappiness, and all the other drama associated with designers and developers and all that. So while this can be replicated on a web today, except it will have a lot of overhead, and you have to create some sort of JavaScript to replicate this kind of custom text wrapping. So Adobe is having a proposal in the W3C that will allow you to do this natively on the web, except it's not there yet in any stable browser. So it's not just this that's the problem. You would also have, you have to create like 10 mockups, right? You have to show it to your client, and then finally the client will tell you that, oh, it all looks nice, but I just need this to be a darker shade of white or a brighter shade of pink or something like that, a small link. And then you have to spend another 10 hours changing each of these mockups with the brighter shade of pink or whatever is asked of you, and then present it again and go through the cycle. So this brings us to the point of what is web design anyway? Like, why is this so disconcerting? Because 10 years ago, the print process workflow and the web design workflow were closely matched. Because a web page was equivalent to a page from a brochure or a print magazine. And all the user had to do was click, and then a new page loaded. It is as good as turning a page in a brochure. So in that sense, even if you were sending a feedback, at most you'll be sending an email, and it'll be opening, you'll have a mail to link, and it'll open in a native email client, and then you'll be sending emails. That's all you had to do. So in a way, at that point, your web design was the legacy of print, and your process workflow matching was not a problem. But these days, that's not the way web works. And we have gone beyond just clicking on links and opening new pages. We have whole new interactions that happen when users click on links. So web pages these days are dynamic. And if you have static pages, even then you'll have like a tweet button or a Facebook-like button, and maybe Twitter stream of your Twitter or of your tweets and so on, even though it's like almost a static page. So what is more important these days is to design the interaction experience. Like, that's what is more important than just design how the graphics look like on your page. So it's almost as though you're actually creating a product. You're actually creating a chair. It's equivalent to that. And you just not have to choose the fabric of the chair, but you also have to decide on how comfortable it is, whether it's maintainable, will it break, and how much weight can it withhold, and whether it gets in the way of the user's experience. So here is an example of the static page that I showed you. And this is a website of a music record label. Notice that even though it's almost static, there's also carousels going on the banner, and also on the bottom right, which is about the labels, even though it's almost a very static page. On the other end of the spectrum is a page like Google+, where you can do hundreds of things in just one page. You can have video chats, you can have text chats, you can have a blog post, you can like a blog post, you can comment on a blog post, add a friend, remove a friend, change your whole life, all of it in a G+ page. And this kind of interaction is not something you can design in a mockup. It's something that you can only create in prototypes. So it's not just about mockups and prototypes. 10 years ago, the only way you had to access a web page was on a desktop browser. So you could like optimize for 640 into 400, I don't know how much it is, and then expect that kind of design to work across all browsers consistently, at least almost. But now we have at least 5 or 6 different devices with different kinds of dimensions and different kinds of features to support. So are you going to be creating mockups for each of these devices? That doesn't seem right. And maybe in 5 years from now, we'll have 20 other devices. And how are we going to create mockups or experiences that are optimized for each of them? So this brings me to the point that we need to embrace the constraints of the web if we have to design for the web, which means we have to create prototypes on the web. So let's look at what is the constraints the web imposes on us. The first constraint, which is very hard for graphic artists to understand, is that there is no such thing as pixel perfection. We try really, really hard, especially if we come from print background, that to optimize, the vertical rhythms and, make sure that images align with your vertical rhythms and so on and so forth. Try as you might, browsers do something or the other to make sure that you never accomplish your holy grail of pixel perfection. So, so there is, when you keep targeting pixel perfection, you're giving up on actually designing the interaction experience for the users. So there's a trade-off, and the trade-off needs to be made towards the side of better user experience than towards the side of better visual perfection. So most browsers do not have, consistency of features anymore. So you may want to use, gradients, and maybe some browsers do not support some syntaxes. Maybe some browsers do not even support gradients. You may want to use drag and drop APIs, and some browsers do not support that. So there is no such thing as designing with, for one particular browser and hoping it will work on all browsers. That's not the case. Plus, when you're designing these days, you kind of want some things to never interact with each other ever, except that they will always end up interacting. And then this is something that you cannot detect in your mockups because you have complete control over your mockups. You never imagine that these elements will interact. So maybe there's a report as spam button and a login button, and then you design them the same way, and you expect them to be never placed side by side in any of the pages, except they will be placed side by some miracle and some quirk of the page. Then what do? Then you can't possibly have the same kind of focus to log in and report as spam. And also in your print tools, when you're creating mockups, you have complete control over your content. So you can actually have the second letter of the second sentence of the second paragraph be hot pink. But you cannot have that in a website. Or you can, but it's going to be at a considerable cost. So if you create it in a print tool, that's not going to reflect the reality that exists on the web. So print tools kind of make it such that they give you the illusion of control that does not exist on the web. So they make it appear as though these features are very trivial to implement, like we just saw in mockups that custom text wrapping, but how easy it is to do in a print tool. You can even have text on a path in a print tool very trivially, except it's a little bit harder on the web. You need to use SVG and so on. And if you use print tools, it gives you an illusion that it's very easy to do, except it's not. Plus, it's hard to change something on print tools. As we saw, changing it to a brighter shade of the same color is a little difficult to do in a print tool. And Lorem Ipsum, this is something that gets me always, which is that when you have designs, you always use Lorem Ipsum and Jane Doe's and some standard avatar images. And then it will only get you so far, because once you have real data coming in, then you'll see that you're trying to shoehorn real data into the design that you've created. So maybe you have designed for like only 3 sentences to occupy a bio line or something like that in your web design, except that someone has like 5 sentence lines, or maybe their bio in Chinese, and it doesn't occupy the kind of line height and readable distance that you've allocated for that sentence. And even though CSS3 effects are like inspired by print tools and the effects that they're found on print tools, they are not quite the same because they have to cater to multi-platform, multiple browsers, and all the legacy code and so on, and they don't quite match to what print tools provide. So if you try to recreate CSS3 effects in print tools, it's a little bit hard, and it's even harder to recreate the complicated effects that print tools provide in CSS3. So it's best to start prototyping in HTML rather than use mockups and try to reconcile the two. So there is the basic fundamental advantages that prototyping provide that make it the better option when you're creating designs with web. The first benefit is that you can finally actually design for the content and the user interaction, because that is the primary thing that you have to be focusing on, which is design around the user interaction and the content. Because these days, a click is not just a click. Like, it doesn't open just a new page. It actually has an effect on the user's lives, even. Because by clicking on a link, the user could be posting an embarrassing picture to Twitter or Facebook, or deleting the most important email of their lives. So there's so many things that can happen with just a click these days that never happens before, like 10 years ago. So you need to be careful of that interaction and make sure you design around that rather than shoehorn the interaction into the graphic design that you've made with your mockup. And while you are using prototypes, HTML prototyping, print tools are not dead, but use that to optimize your prototypes. So maybe once you've created a prototype that works with the user interaction and the content, use your print tools to create icons or the branding that goes with the prototype so that it fits with the rest of the branding strategy, or maybe you want to make it more welcoming and more friendly to the user. Use those print tools and create these graphics to augment your prototype. So once you create your prototypes, you will know where design breaks these experiences. Like maybe when you have silos of mockups, you just do not realize that maybe there are 4 or 5 clicks to reach to a login button in your website. But once you have a HTML prototype, it's easy and trivial to see that it's a lot of complicated process before you reach your login button, so maybe that needs to be optimized. And you will also be able to find out where the data breaks the design. So, as I said, in mockup, you have full control of the content that goes in. But when you have HTML prototypes, you can use real data to detect where the design is breaking. So maybe there is a username with more than 40 characters, or maybe there's a username with some Unicode characters that you did not account for. How will that look like? And so there's a link called Wireframing for Web Apps, which talks about this in much further detail, and I recommend you go through that. So once you create a prototype, you will always have, you have to use templates so that it is consistent and is easy to use and trivial to use. So once you have templates, it's very trivial to export them to either WordPress or Drupal or Ruby or some Haskell static site generator or whatnot. Whatever you want, you can have that with just if you're using HTML prototypes. So the other thing is that, as I said, you have 101 things that a user can do, and the G+ page was like an example of how that could happen. And there's a lot of complexity involved in that G+ page, but it's all shown in a simple way to the user. So the way you can design around that is not by building mockups, but by building prototypes such that the user does not get the full effect of the complexity and uncertainty that is involved in a web page, but you control the whole thing so that it is not visible to the user. And then there's a very good article on that, and again, as I said, I have a whole bunch of links, so go through that as well. So once you have HTML prototyping, you can also do what is now very common in the new jargon, which is responsive web design. And so you can build from the ground up and start with the very basic design that will work on all browsers, and then add on the design elements that you want for different dimensions, and have it work such that you optimize for all the areas where the design breaks in these resolutions and so on. And there is Stephen Hayes, he's been talking about that quite a while, about responsive design workflow. And there is a post about his talk, and explains and has notes on his talk as well, and So if you're interested in responsive web design with HTML prototyping, so that's the place that you should be going to. So when you have to start with HTML prototypes, it's a bit it's a bit you kind of get confronted. What do you do? Like with Photoshop, we had the pleasant, calm, white page to start from. It's blank, it's serene. You are familiar with it. You can get started with it. But with HTML prototyping, you get a blank HTML page to start from. How do you get started? So there are some things when you start coding, immediately you kind of assume that this is true, this is not true, some things that you should give up, especially when you're doing prototypes. So the first thing that you have to not worry about is performance. Because performance does not matter when you're creating prototypes because it's just a prototype. And once you are done with creating prototypes, then you can look at what are the things that I should be removing so that this page is optimized for page rendering or page loading and so on. So the other thing that I think you shouldn't care about, and I'm sure I'll get more flack for this, is pointless semantics, especially when prototyping. I will not talk about the other way. I think I'll get calls for being fired again. Never mind. So what I'm saying is you don't have to worry about if it's a div or it's a section or if it's an article or a hedge group or a time. It does not matter. All you need to worry about is how it looks on the browser, the design, not about which kind of markup you're using in your prototype. And then pixel perfection and layout perfection, while it's great to try to strive towards these, when you're creating prototypes, you start with low fidelity and work your way towards high fidelity. So when you're really close to having a production-ready design, make sure that you kind of optimize for these pixel optimizations at the end rather than at the beginning. And this is a common kind of it's temptation to optimize for pixel perfection right at the beginning. So you give up on the big picture and just focus on the small ones, and then everything goes to hell. OK. Then old Ie compatibility is something you should never, ever worry about when you're prototyping. And maybe you should worry about once you're in production, but I would recommend you don't even worry about it at the time, because you will have, you can either use prompt people to download Chrome Frame, or you can provide a tailored experience for less enabled browsers, such that maybe it's even browsers on feature phones and old IEs get the same experience. It's up to you. But don't be limited by what IE supports or old IE supports or does not support, because your design was much more than that. So I wish I could tell you that there is one tool that will save you right now, but there isn't, or at least not that I know of. If you find something, please let me know. But I have found some tools that help me when I'm doing HTML prototypes for different small websites that I create. And the only criteria I look for each of these tools is that it enables me to write as less code as I can get away with so that I can see the design on the browser instantly. So there are some tools that you should be aware of. So I think the first thing is you need a scaffolding generator. What a scaffolding generator would do is to create new web pages on the fly or with as less effort as possible. So there are two, basically it means it's a static site generator. So you'll have templates that will be compiled and then output in a folder, and that will be just a complete static site. And the good part about this is that you can take that published folder and then send it to your client or put it in your Dropbox or put it in your FTP or whatever, and then show it to your client, get approval on the prototype, and then keep working on it so that you still have your templates, you still have your output generated files. So there are two things that are popular. The docpad is for Node, and Jekyll is for Ruby, and Jekyll is what GitHub Pages uses. It's up to you whichever flavor you prefer. I am familiar with JavaScript, so I prefer the docpad and the Node version. And use sane defaults. Obviously, I'm biased, but HTML5 boilerplate provides the same defaults. You don't have to worry about things, and it's a good starter template for you to get started with on your projects. And again, in the principle of, in the note of philosophy of writing as less code as you can get away with, style preprocessors are pretty useful for that. Farouk already mentioned how they are useful for vendor prefixes. So you just write one line, one CSS declaration, and it'll spout out all the vendor prefixes necessary for that declaration. But it's not just that. You also have certain basic programming principles in that. So you can have if conditions and the loops and all those things that you typically do not have in CSS. And Sass is based on Ruby, and less and stylers are based on Node. So whichever flavor you prefer, go for it. I really like SAS syntax, so I always use SAS. And naming conventions is something always that gets me, because every time I'm writing markup, I start typing class is equal to, and then ponder over for 1 minute on what I should name the stupid class. Because I'm like, I want to reuse this pattern, except I don't know if I will. And sometimes, 2 years ago, even I would have ended up with, slightly different class names, like tab container, tab parent, tab nav, or something like that. So it's pretty annoying, because you want to be able to reuse these names. And so you would want to use a naming convention and stick to it. And if you forget the naming convention, at least have a link to the naming convention in your prototype so that you can get back to it once you're once you're done with the project and you want to revert back to the project after maybe 6 months or 2 years or whatnot. So there is one naming convention called block element module that has been pioneered by the people at Yandex, the Russian search engine. And they wrote a good article about that on Smashing Magazine. So I recommend you read it. It's a little bit complicated, though. So Nicholas Gallagher has a riff on it, which is a little bit simpler and easier to understand. And that's what I've been using so far. And it seems to be working for me. So if you're using templates, you'd be using one of the templating languages, and it's up to you what you want. But Haml is a bit more harder to learn, because it requires a little more of a steeper learning curve. But again, if it helps you write less code as possible, go for it. So this is my favorite, which is fake real data. So how many of you know Ryan Singer, 37 signals? Okay, a few of you. Okay. Anyway, he's the one who pioneered the HTML prototyping in 37 Signals Basecamp app. And it was pretty well known for how usable the app was. Anyway, I saw a video of him prototyping HTML on Peep code. And I saw that he was using Ruby, and he was he wanted username and avatar image for about 50 users or so. And then he had a for loop. And then all he did was have a Jane Doe or something similar with a blank image style for the user image. And I was like, if you are prototyping HTML, why don't we just have some real-looking data so that it'll be better reflecting the kind of data that will actually fill in once you actually have real data? And obviously, I'm not the only one to think of that, which I realized much later to show how ignorant I was. But then when I started looking for it, I found out there's something called faker.js, which is a Node.js implementation of a real-looking, but fake data. And this was originally done in Perl and then imported to Ruby and now finally to Node. So what it has is it has a bunch of names, first names, last names, then domain names, and phone numbers of different formats, US addresses, UK addresses, and I think someone added Brazilian addresses recently or something. And it also even has a bullshit generator, Lorem Ipsum generator, and so on and so forth. So basically, you can have a good variety of real-looking fake data, and it's all generated. So it is not like there is a authentic real person with that particular name the identity has been stolen from or anything. That's not true. So I'll show an example of how this works a little bit later. So once you have, as I said, you want to outsource as much of the housekeeping as possible. And one of the ways you could do it is if you're using Twitter Bootstrap to, you don't want to worry about which columns are left aligned, right aligned, and all that. So you could have your grids, all of that generated with Twitter Bootstrap. And the good part is that it has a custom builder, so you don't have to download the entire thing. Just download what you want for each project and start using that so that you can focus on the bigger design and the bigger user experience rather than on the minute details of the implementation. So finally, it is, the most annoying thing about coding is you have to continually refresh your page every time you save your code. So it's not just saving Command S, but also it's Command R. So many keystrokes. Why would you want to do that? So you can use a live reader or CodeKit to automate that. So it'll watch the folder where you're working on for all the files. So whenever you have a change saved to a file, it'll reload that page on all the browsers that is open, depending on whether if you're using the browser extension or if you're using the script that it asks you to install every time you're working on that page. So once you're done with all your prototyping, you're ready to go to production, what you should be doing ideally is documenting your code, because invariably, even though you may not like it, you may have to come back to it after 6 months or maybe 2 years and do something slightly differently. So it's much better if you actually document what you did rather than to recreate everything all over again. So the way to do that is if you're using scripts, then Jeremy Ashkenaz wrote doco. I don't think I need to explain that. But what is most interesting for me is documenting your styles with style doco. And this is created by an Opera developer called Jacob Rask. And this is how it looks like. So all you need to do is provide a comment that's here. I hope you can see it, but what it does is in the comment, you just explain what it does, what that particular CSS rule does, and then provide the markup that is necessary for you to render that CSS rule, like how it should be rendered. And then you notice that at the bottom in the output section, it has the same text, but in the HTML nice format, and the rendering of that button itself. So it'll just parse your CSS and create a HTML page, which will have this text and the button rendered. And I think this is pretty useful if you're coming back after 2 years and not knowing how a particular style class name needs to be used. Anyway, so I just want to show how I use faker.js. I just created a small prototype called my Rolodex. As you can see, the design is barked, which I would not have noticed if I had done it beautifully in a print tool. And so the way this works is I have a docpad template, and I'm using, this is my default template. And so I have a welcome section here where I have @require faker and then name.findName, which reflects in welcome Ivar Lemke. So it's a random name that is generated. So maybe I do not want the full name, maybe I just want the first name, and then I just use first name, and then, wait, oh, there you go. So, so it says first name Crystal, and if you notice, all the other data has also been regenerated. And the 3-letter thing, E enable B2C bandwidth, is the bullshit generator I told you about, which is pretty interesting, and I think it fits this app perfectly. So because of this prototype, I know immediately that the logo on the left will just not work on this design at all, and I need to change this design. And because of this random name I have, so I can also see the kind of width that the name occupies. Maybe there's, some of these names may be bigger, and I need to account for those things. And so because of this random name generator, I can have a robust design already, even though I may not have the real data available. And the images on the left are generated with Lorem Ipsum. And you could always use lorempixel.com, and you could always use place kittens or place dogs, but I'd rather use real random images rather than random images of kittens or dogs. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you, but before I go, I want to just quickly pimp that Adobe is hiring. So if you're interested in working in San Francisco and you love the web, just talk to me or Dimitri or the other PhoneGap guys. Anyway, thank you for your time.